Welcome to an episode of the Unmeasured podcast where I am so excited to be chatting with my friend Jessi Haggerty. Jessi, welcome to the Unmeasured podcast.
Thank you.
I'm so happy that you're here today. For anyone who does not know Jessi, Jessi is a registered dietitian, a certified intuitive eating counselor, and personal trainer in private practice in Boston, Massachusetts. She specializes in helping her clients redefine their relationship with food and exercise and creates educational content for personal trainers who want to do the same. Jessi, you do such important work in the intuitive eating and intuitive movement space, and you are the perfect person to get to chat about today's listener question, which is about intuitive movement. This listener shared that I grew up non athletic and hated traditional exercise, as well as just rebelling against diet culture in general. Your wonderful classes are the closest I come to formal exercise. I do enjoy them once started, but still have to overcome a deep seated aversion to the idea of exercise before I begin. It's just super hard for me to associate structured movement with joy and ease. Would love some perspectives and conversations and tips around that.
Love this question.
Me too. I love it, and I think it points to something that doesn't often get talked about, which is that our relationship with movement has a lot of different parts. There
Mm,
could be, like, beliefs or feelings leading up to movement. There could be what we actually experience, like, when we're moving. It could be what we experience afterwards, and those things are not always the same, right? Like, for this listener, once she's doing a form of movement that she feels good to her body, like, she does enjoy it, but it's the moments before that feel so hard. Have you have you ever in your personal relationship with movement experienced, like, the pre-workout aversion?
yeah, I'm nodding.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I actually, the older I've gotten, the more I've been able to identify that I think a lot of because I am someone who can like identify with this listener, like, or this question asker, like, I really, for the most part, enjoy movement, like, once I'm in it, but have, like, always had to kind of get over a little bit of a hump, and I think a little bit of that is, like, ADHD related of just, like, moving from one task to the next, and with exercise, it's not just, like, task to task, it's like you're asking yourself to, like, take your body into a completely different state. Often, if we're, like, going from, like, sitting at a desk to, like, going to a workout class or resting on the couch to getting up and, like, going for a run. That's, like, kind of a huge ask for most people, but especially if you have any type of neurodivergence, that could be also
Yes.
really hard.
Jesse, I love that you brought up how neurodivergence can play into this and can play into the transition of tasks, because that is something that so many people deal with. We have in the last year, I've discovered we have a very neurodivergent household. And so I've been doing my best to learn, like, more about that and how to, best, like, love my family members and support them. And it's been so fascinating just to see how different people process different situations. It's not like good or bad, it's just different. And
Mm.
so I really appreciate you mentioning that. In terms of making that transition or making that leap into movement, I think that when it comes to intuitive movement, there can be this belief or understanding that you never push yourself, or you never, like, quote unquote, make yourself work out if there's, like, any resistance to it.
Mhm.
And I'd love to talk a little bit about that piece of it, because yes, intuitive eating is loving, it is compassionate. It does focus on how you feel and honoring your body and removing the diet culture from movement. And I also think that there can be moments where there's, like, a loving, gentle nudge to get into the movement when you, like, have the belief that, like, the movement will feel good and that it will be beneficial for your future self. What how do you approach that topic, either with yourself or with, your clients? What does that gentle nudge look like? Or do you even my opinion is that sometimes there can be a gentle nudge. Do you agree with that, or are you like, "Never nudge"?
I feel like I need nudges to do, like, anything in life, so
Same.
we gotta nudge. We gotta nudge
We
sometimes.
need the gentle nudge.
I'm like, I'd be in bed all day, every day if I didn't be nudging myself. I think that well, for me is I can answer for myself, but I will say for, like, anybody listening, I think it's really important to just have kind of an understanding of how you relate to exercise because if you tend to be someone who like doesn't need the nudge and maybe like needs a nudge to rest or like take a day off, then this can look very different. I don't feel like I've maybe battled a little bit of feeling like I should do something or this, like I have to push myself farther than maybe is necessary or than is good for me. But in recent years, I've not really, struggled with that, and I think what has worked best for me is giving myself that nudge and really trying to, like, hone in on my intuition when I'm in the movement itself, and so often now, these days, what that looks like is I have a scheduled time where I do my structured exercise, and once I'm there and in it, I can choose like how much to push or how much to kind of reserve or preserve myself. And some days that means like I'm skipping like very large portions of what I had planned. And some days that might mean like doing more than maybe not doing more than I planned, that rarely ever happens, but, doing something that maybe pushing myself to do something that I wouldn't normally do. And that to me feels like that is how I like to practice intuitive movement these days instead of it being like, do I feel like doing it today or do I feel like not? Because that still feels very black and white to me. Like I like to think of it as like the spectrum of like a 1 to 10, and it's like a 1 can still be just like a little bit, maybe it's not much at all, and it can be different from person to person, like your 1 might be different than my 1 too.
I love that so much. I love the idea of setting aside the time, prioritizing that time since it's important to you, and then getting into it. And once you start to move, making a decision like, what feels best for me today? Is it a little bit? Is it more? Is it intense? Is it slower? Like, whatever it might be. And I too find that having scheduled set aside time for formal movement. And also, I mean, I guess, can we call it informal movement if I'm also scheduling time for it? But scheduled informal movement in the way that if I look at my work day and it's a nice day outside and I know that I want to go for a walk and listen to a podcast and just maybe walk to get a cup of coffee. I wouldn't necessarily call that like a formal workout, but I even will just block 30 minutes on my calendar for the day so that when I'm done with like a client session, I don't have to sit there and think and figure out like, well, what am I going to do? Because sometimes for me, I can use up all of my time that I could have taken, like, a nice little walk around the park with my dog to get a cup of coffee, trying to figure out, "Well, should I do that? Or should I write an email? Or should I" and then I'm like, "Well, the 30 minutes is gone, I've done
Yeah,
nothing." And
yeah,
moving
fair
right
enough.
along to my next call. And so for me, even something like that, that might be viewed as more informal movement, I have found that for me, putting that time on there just helps me to actually, like, get to do the thing that I'm gonna enjoy, like, once I
Yeah,
start doing it. And also, since having kids, since becoming a mom, it's almost, like, non-negotiable that the time has to be set aside. Otherwise, I just get, swept up in everyone else's needs.
yeah,
And that time doesn't end up getting prioritized. And so I think there was a season for me after doing a lot of healing work in my relationship with movement where I really felt like I was in a good, healthy place, that I could be a little more flowy with it, let's say. I had my own business. I had multiple chunks of time that I could do different things in during the day. And so it felt like I could be much more in the moment and like a little flowy with it. That isn't this season in my life. And I feel like if it isn't, the time isn't set aside, I know for certain that it's not going to happen. So I am with you 100% on like scheduling the time. And for me, I try to also show up in that time and sort of feel it out as I'm going. It might be a bar class where I'm taking way more coffee breaks. It
Yeah.
might be a bar class like where I'm not, but showing up in that time, except if I wake up and I feel really exhausted. If I'm like, I'm just totally depleted today, and then I will use that time for something else that feels a little bit like relaxing or peaceful, or like I'll sit on the couch and I'll watch a rerun of Felicity, like something like that that feels fun, that feels like something for myself. But if I'm really exhausted, that's when I'll call it before I even get on my mat, because I'm just like, it's not gonna help today. And I always check in. I'm like, am I tired from the neck down or from the neck up? If I'm tired from the neck down, it's like I'm not doing it. If
Yeah.
I'm tired from the neck up, if it's like that brain fogginess, sometimes for me, gentle movement can actually help me to like really clear some of that out.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
When you think about clients who you work with as a personal trainer around movement, do you how do you work through like supporting them around their resistance? Does that ever come up, and how do you work through like supporting them with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the biggest thing is, like I said earlier, is like trying to kind of get underneath like how they relate to exercise and movement now. And I also think that I really love like helping people like figure out like what a low hanging fruit is, because I think that a lot of times there's when we try to start going from like no, let's call it like even structured or unstructured, however you want to look at it, movement to something, it's more than just like adding that one task in. There's often like so many other steps involved in it. So even like, I mean, I used to always be like, "Oh, I wish I could just like be someone who like goes and like walks in the woods." And like it took me like getting a dog to start doing that, which is like really kind of turns your life upside down if you didn't have one before.
So
Um,
many more walks are necessary.
we
It's
love
like
him,
wild.
but he has high energy needs. But even that, like, I'm like, okay, so it's not just like going to the woods, it's like one finding like the trail, and like for me who is like directionally challenged is like making sure I know where I'm going, so I'm like not getting lost. And so that it takes, I think, a lot of like bandwidth to go from like zero to doing something. And so one is like always trying to understand like how much of that do you actually have, and if it's very minimal, then like let's start there instead of trying to commit to something that's going to end up turning your life upside down.
Yes. I think it is really important to acknowledge all of the steps that it takes to get to the thing that, you want to do, because that can be like a big chunk of time. Even like a commute to get somewhere. If you have to drive somewhere, if you have to change your clothes, all of those things are steps that have to happen. And I do think they create like a mental load as well. I love this idea of a low-hanging fruit and what can you start with? And then my experience has been that once I do something a couple of times, like even if it has nothing to do with movement, maybe it's, driving to a new place in town. Once I've done that a couple of times and I'm like, okay, I know where the parking is and I know the exits that I have to get off on and like those types of things, it doesn't feel as big of a lift to do it once I
Mhm.
have those things in my wheelhouse and I've done it a couple of times. And so I think if you start with a low hanging fruit, it's like your resilience and confidence around that is going to build. And then there might be like a next low hanging fruit from there if you want that.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, to that point, I always talk about like trying to build a bank of positive experiences with exercise because if like it's going to start causing stress, not forget about like the actual exercise, but like the getting there or like the paying for it or whatever it may be, then over time, like it does kind of accumulate to be this like overall like not so great experience. And so if doing a little bit and it feels manageable and accessible helps it feel more positive over time, like it gets easier to add more if that's what you want. Not that you always
Absolutely.
have to add more
No,
either.
you do not always have to add more. And I think for the purposes of this like question, it's moving over the resistance of doing it, not that it always has to be more. And like you said in the beginning, for some people, it's a resistance to doing less. And that's also a resistance you might need to lovingly nudge yourself through. For sure. I I think it's so interesting to look at like different seasons of life and what felt like a big hurdle versus what didn't. There was a time in my life where I went to a bar studio, like an in-person studio, loved it, loved it, loved it so much. Like there was no part of me that was like forcing myself to go there. It was a joy. And I did that most days. And it didn't feel like a lift at all. In this season of life, I take an in-person, in-studio bar class once a week. Sometimes it's every other week with my mentor and the woman who trained me to be a bar instructor, and, like, I love getting to go there. I usually go with, like, a friend or 2. It feels very fun once a week or once every other week, and I found that, like, to do that feels like a way heavier lift for me today than it did, 7 years ago,
Sure.
and I, like, love getting to literally be in my pajamas and just roll a mat out, like, in my house and do movement right there. Like, there's so many less hurdles. It's such a lower lift for me in this season of life, and so I also think it's like it changes.
Yeah. It's so funny too to hear you talking about that because I am like the opposite now. Like I would truly love, and I have kind of like always attempted this, is to like be someone who can kind of like just like zone everything out and like work out at home in my pajamas. And I talking about like task initiation like does not, my brain just like cannot do that consistently. And it's interesting in like this season of life, I had really done really not any formal movement, like maybe for up to like a year after I had my son, which is like weird to say because he's like over a year now.
I can't believe that. It's like time just flies.
I know. But so for the past 6 months, at that point, once he turned like, it was like a little bit before he turned one, I ended up starting to go to this studio by my house that was like is very like structured in that like you show up at like a certain time. It's a class, but it's more like kind of you're doing it on your own or you're doing the exercises on your own. And what's been interesting is that there are parts of it that I very much enjoy and parts of it that like my perfectionism kicks in a little bit where I'm like, especially being a trainer, I'm like, oh, I kind of wish they like program this differently or like I don't really love that they put this exercise in there. And I just kind of like at this point keep coming back to like my values and goals. Like what are my goals for like this phase of life? And really like becoming a mom kind of like kicked my butt physically a little bit, like just being postpartum and then like all the extra lifting that you have to do. Like I was like, wow, this is kind of a lot.
Totally.
So
I was like, do I have tennis elbow?
No,
like, from, like, just
seriously, like,
holding my
why is my voice
child.
always hurt? What's going on? So, I was like, "I wanna rebuild my strength, and I don't wanna have to be, like, using a ton of mental energy to, like, program my own workouts or even the mental energy to, like, decide when I'm gonna go to the gym," because I kind of, at this point, feel like I need to be out of the house, like and it's, like, nice for me to be out of the house too a little bit, but, um, so it's been interesting. I think that that's a no whole other piece of this is, like, to be able to kind of identify, like, where your values are, in terms of, like, why is doing structured movement even important to you? And if, like, we're having trouble identifying why, then, like, maybe 1, like, we don't have to push so hard to do it, or 2, like, to really prioritize, like, what those values are. Is it just to, like, get in a little bit of movement? Do we have to, like, get outside of the house, or would it feel nice to I mean, that was kind of, like, why I started doing it because I was like, "I need something to, like, get me out of this house every day," or most days, you know?
Totally. Yes. I love this idea of identifying your values, identifying your goals, like really connecting with the why. Like, why is this even important? Why is this important to me? Why is this important, like, right now in my life? And letting that guide you. And then I think when you feel a little bit of resistance, maybe like whether it's doing something at home, whether it's going to a studio, whether it's going to a gym, whatever it might be, going for a walk, whatever it is, that you can come back to that and connect with that thing that feels really important to you or those things that feel really important to you. I do think that it's important just to note that as we're talking about lovingly, like nudging ourselves through resistance, like that there is an inner dialogue going on during that, right? And what kinds of things are you saying to yourself to make that a positive experience for yourself or a neutral experience for yourself rather than an experience where you might be, criticizing yourself or saying mean things about yourself in an effort to motivate yourself, like rather than it being like a negative inner dialogue or like really shame inducing. Um what does it look like to be kind and compassionate to or what does it sound like to be kind and compassionate to yourself as you are, moving through that?
Yeah. I think, um, personally, and I think that this is actually true for a lot of people, I have not ever really done well with, like, any type of inner dialogue that sounds like an affirmation because I think that there's like a more critical part of me that like wants to double down on that of like that's not true, like you're not that good or something like that. So I try to always frame things with like in the form of a question. And so one of the things that I've been um doing for myself and also talking more with clients about is like looking at exercise through the lens of safety as well, of like, what do I need to feel safe right now? Because I find that like most of us, when we're like not having a positive exercise experience, is because we're like trying to like push ourselves way out of our window of tolerance. So our nervous system is kind of like, what the fuck? And then we don't want to do it anymore. um, so that is kind of like what I've been coming back to is like, what do I need to feel safe or what do I need to feel um, good or strong in this moment? And sometimes that's like, it's very logistical of like needing to put less weight on the movement that I'm doing or skip something altogether or sub in a totally different exercise, um, take a break, leave class early, stuff like that. And so I think that that is one way that like I can have like a more positive like internal dialogue because I'm like constantly trying to ask myself what would feel helpful instead of it having to be this like I don't know, inner like cheerleader. That just never felt real to me, I guess.
Totally. And I think were you a cheerleader?
No, but I did teach bar for many years, and I felt
Mhm.
like I was definitely doing some sort of cheerleading when I was teaching. You kind of like enter a different zone, I think.
Yeah.
And, I was like very motivational. And then I think I just kind of got like tired of hearing myself talk, maybe. But
Totally, totally fair. I was not a cheerleader.
yeah.
I once tried out for gosh, I don't remember what it was called, but it's the thing where the girls have the flags and then they like link arms and do a lot of kicking.
Huh?
But it's not cheerleading, but it's something like that.
Like
And
dance team? No.
is
Kick line?
well,
Something
maybe
like
it's
that?
like a kick line. I want to say I'm like, was it called Golden Girls? But I'm like, that couldn't have been the name of it. It can't be Golden Girls, right? And I tried out, and I remember that the song was Blue. Was it like Eiffel 69,
Oh,
whatever
yeah.
that, yeah, you know? And I probably botched the name of that group, but I will never forget the routine was that song, and I wanted to be on this team so badly, and I worked so hard, and I auditioned, and not only did I not make it, but I literally peed myself during the audition. It was like such a disaster,
Oh my God.
and that was the closest I ever got to anything like, in the realm of cheerleading.
Yeah.
I love the question of, what do you need to feel safe right now, or what would help you to feel safe right now? I always love coming into a situation with curiosity. So I think that's such a beautiful way to connect with yourself and to address yourself in those moments. And I am such a firm believer that when you're working on your inner dialogue, that like it has to feel true.
Yeah.
Like you can't feel like you're just lying to yourself. Like you
Right.
have to connect with something that feels honest. I think compassion is honest.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, if your version of self compassion at a deep level feels like you are lying to yourself or like trying to trick yourself, that's not, I don't think that's like what we're going for. You want it to feel honest. And so I love that. I love that you found a way to navigate that without it being like a rah rah cheerleader that does not feel authentic or honest, but coming into it with such like lovely curiosity. That's really, really cool. I love that.
Yeah. I think that that's how I think a lot of people perceive self-compassion. It's like fake. And I'm like, no, it's not.
Totally.
It's just that I think that it's been packaged like in this weird way where it feels that way, but it's like it can sound different to everyone.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's going to be your own voice. So it's going to be different from person to person. And I think that approaching it with those questions is such an awesome way to navigate those moments of resistance when, yeah, you might need a nudge, but you want it to come from a loving place and connecting with your why, connecting with your values, connecting with your goals, and connecting with whatever that voice of self compassion sounds like are such great ways to move through that. This listener mentioned that in general, actually, I want to use her exact words. I still have to overcome a deep seated aversion to the idea of exercise. Um, it's super hard for me to associate structured movement with joy and ease. To this point, I love what you said about building up this positive experience bank, this bank of positive moments where you really get to feel a different reality. And I do think that for some people, doing some journaling around this, if this feels really big, if it feels like I have this really big story around movement, like writing out what that story is, and then maybe identifying some experiences that are true to that story, but also saying, like, but what are my experiences that don't line up with this story? And what have those been like for me? and creating a new narrative, I do think the act of writing that for some people can be really helpful. I know not everyone's a journaler, um, and that's totally fine to the point of like how self-compassion can sound different for different people. I think we process things differently, but if it feels like there is this narrative that this more like structured movement cannot possibly be joyful or fun or easeful. Um, where did that narrative come from? And also, what else might be true that would feel more supportive and more empowering right now in your life? And what are the real life experiences that you've had that prove that it's possible?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think also like some of the questions that like pop up into my head are like, what would it even look like for something like that to feel joyful? And is that does that feel necessary for you? Like I don't think that if something isn't like joyful that it's bad. I mean, obviously you don't want it to feel bad or feel I'm like, what's the opposite of joyful? Like
Sad. I
sad.
don't know.
You don't want it to feel sad. You don't want it to make you feel worse. But I think that that's kind of why I like to look at, especially more like structured movement, like through that lens, like that values driven lens, because I think that if there if it just feels like you're looking for something to move your body that feels joyful, then maybe it doesn't have to be this like super structured form of movement either. Like maybe that we can like take that off your plate and we don't have to do that. Or if it feels like there are other benefits that you might get from that, like the joy can come from like fulfilling those values instead of it being like, oh, I'm doing it. Like, I don't think I feel joy when I'm doing some forms of exercise, but I do feel aligned. So it does that make sense?
It totally makes sense, and I
I'm like,
love
would
the word
I rather be
aligned.
like sitting on the beach and like eating potato chips right now? Like, sure. And that also feels aligned, but they're both, you
Yes.
know.
I think in this instance, of course, through the lens of someone's values and goals, movement, maybe it's more functional.
Yeah,
It's like this functionally supports my goals and values and it's not doing me harm. Again, like no
mhm,
one here is telling you
yeah,
to go do something that, is like hurting your body or pushing yourself to the point of like, burnout and exhaustion and like
right.
hormonal imbalance. No one's saying
Yeah,
anything like that, but maybe it's more neutral. Like you said, it's
yeah.
like it feels aligned. It's not causing
Functional is like
harm. that
was
Yeah.
kind of the word I
Yeah.
was
Totally. It's like it functionally supports those goals in the way that like I don't love brushing my teeth but I do it twice a day because it's a functional thing that I do to take care of myself. I see the value. It is connected to, like personal goals of I guess I don't know that I have like goals about oral health, but like I guess if we like dug into it, I would
You
say I
don't
would
want your teeth to
yeah,
fall out.
totally. Like I guess I do have goals for oral health. But that thing where maybe for some people formal movement can be really joyful and that's great, but maybe for other people formal movement is more functional and that's also great.
Yeah.
I really love the idea of sort of taking the pressure off, where it's like you don't always have to think this is like the most joyful thing in the entire world.
Yeah.
I will say something that I do to make workouts more enjoyable when I'm feeling
Mhm.
some resistance is I will roll my mat out in front in front of my TV and I'll put my laptop at the end of my mat and I'll mute it so I just watch and do the moves, but then I put something that I like really
Yeah.
like watching up on the TV and it maybe is sort of like mindless show or a rerun of something that I love or a romantic comedy, like the number of times that I have watched Something's Gotta Give and it's complicated while I'm doing like a bar class, I couldn't, the limit does not exist. I don't even know how many times I've done
That's
that.
so funny.
But for me, when I am, realizing this is going to feel good afterwards, but I just would rather be sitting on the couch watching TV. I'm like, well, let's do it both at the same time.
Yeah,
And that helps me to move forward because I'm like, I really am excited to watch this.
yeah.
So I'll do it while I do some, gentle low impact movement. And that works really well for me. So
Yeah.
just throwing it out there. If anyone wants to throw up a Nancy Meyers film, I found that helps increase, that turns up the volume on the joy of a workout.
But that's, like, also a great question to ask is, like, how can I add joy to this? And again, like, if there's something that you're doing that you're like, this feels like torture, then, like, maybe that's just what it is, and we can move on from it. But if it is something that you're like, once you're in it, you're like, "This feels good," um, maybe there are ways to make the kind of, like, lead up to that feel a little bit more joyful as well.
Absolutely. I love that so much. Jessi, I'm so glad that we got to have this conversation today and you just offered so many beautiful insights into having a more intuitive relationship with movement. I always love getting to connect with you. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was so fun.